Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those tuning in from different parts of the world. Welcome to the third week in the long-term animal research seminar series. We continue this week with Dr. Christina Riehl, and before I introduce Christy, I'll make a couple of announcements. First, if you're participating via Zoom, you should see a Q&A tab on either the top or the bottom of your screen. If you open that tab, you'll be able to type any questions that you have, as well as see and upvote other people's questions. And at the end of the talk, we'll go through those questions, starting with the ones with the most votes. However, if you have a clarifying question that you feel like needs to be addressed during the talk, in order for you to understand something, you can type clarification in capital letters at the start of your question, and Christy has said she'll do her best to answer those questions in real time. Second, recordings of this and all of the talks will be available on YouTube shortly after they conclude. So if you need to leave early or know others who are unable to attend live, this talk will be available for viewing and reviewing after it's complete. Now I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Christina Riehl, who is an assistant professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton University. Christy received her undergraduate degree from Harvard before getting her PhD at Princeton. She was then a postdoctoral researcher at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute before becoming a junior fellow at Harvard and then returning to Princeton as an assistant professor. Christy has studied the behavior and life histories of greater anis in Panama for more than 10 years now, and in that time she's contributed important insights into the evolution of cooperation and social parasitism and the dynamics between related and non-related individuals that live in communally breeding groups. Christy visited Duke to give a talk in 2016 when I was a first-year student, and I remember being so impressed and inspired by the clarity with which she outlined evolutionary theory and thinking, and then leveraging data from the anis to test theoretical predictions in really clear ways by actually measuring fitness outcomes of individuals through really intense demographic and behavioral monitoring. So I'm really excited to welcome Christy to this series and hear what she has discovered since I last heard her speak.
Thanks, Matthew. What a nice introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk in this series. I really enjoyed the first two seminars, which were by Joan Silk and Ellen Ketterson. And I'm so honored to be a part of this lineup. But at the same time, it's a bit intimidating because, as Matthew mentioned, I'm just an assistant professor. This is kind of a baby long-term project compared to the work on the baboons and juncos that came before me. So it's kind of big shoes to fill. I've only been working on greater anis for 13 years since I was a graduate student. This picture here is of a greater ani in Panama. And 13 years is not, as you'll see, it's not long enough to really figure out everything that's going on in a species with such a complicated social system as anis have. But it's long enough to see some interesting patterns and to, more importantly, I think, see that what I thought at first, those patterns are not really the full story. They're not wrong, but they're incomplete. And so what I'd like to do today is just share with you some of the overall themes of the project, how it turned into a long-term project from its origins as a graduate project, and then highlight some of the things that we're still working on and some of the things that are still big mysteries that I think will ensure that it continues to be a long-term project. So these are greater anis. Anis are cooperatively breeding tropical birds. They're about the size of a small crow, and they're part of a clade of 4 species, a small clade in the cuckoo family. But unlike many cuckoos, they're not parasitic. All 4 species in this clade are communal nesters, which means they live in social groups year-round. They're sedentary, they don't migrate. They defend their territories year-round, and they stay with their group members for the whole year and often for many years at a time. Within these groups, they forage together, they roost together, and they nest together. So they build a single communal nest. So in terms of their overall life history, because they're long-lived, they live, we think, 15 to 20 years, although we're not sure because I've only been studying them for 13 years. There are like lots of anis that were alive at the beginning of my study that are still there in the population. So because they're sedentary and long-lived and live in these stable social groups, their social lives really look a lot more like a baboon's social life than like a junco's social life. But there are some similarities with juncos. So within these groups, they form socially monogamous pairs. So a typical group is usually either 2 or 3 pairs. Males and females look alike, as you can see from this picture on the upper left there. And the pairs, the social pairs, share a pair bond. So you can see these birds on the right are allopreening. So in that sense, they are like juncos. However, all of the pairs in the group, as I said, usually 2 or 3 pairs, build a single nest, and all the females lay their eggs into that communal nest. This picture on the lower left here is a photograph of a communal nest containing 10 eggs that were laid by 3 unrelated females in the group. So these groups are multi-male, multi-female groups in which most of the adults, although not all of them, and I'll get to that in a second, most of the adults breed. All of the group members contribute to parental care. So they all help build the nest, they all help incubate the eggs. And when the chicks hatch, all of the adults in the group help bring food to the nestlings. So they can't recognize their own eggs. They can't recognize their own nestlings. The adults don't seem to know who's related to whom within these communal clutches. We've confirmed that by doing cross-fostering experiments and messing with eggs and chicks and showing that the adults don't seem to be able to recognize their own offspring. So they pretty much feed the young and take care of the young indiscriminately. All of the adults feed all of the nestlings. So most groups, as I said, consist of 2 or 3 pairs. This is a photograph of a group with 2 pairs where they've all happened to arrive at the nest at the same time. Some groups also have an unpaired bird called a helper that doesn't breed. And these helpers can sometimes be young from the nest that they grew up in. So they can be sometimes help at their natal nest. But they can also be unrelated. They can be immigrants that just joined the group as a lone bird and helped. This is a photograph of those adorable nestlings. So these nestlings, they pretty much stay with their natal group for a full year after they hatch. So as I said, some of those nestlings will then stay on at their natal group and they'll act as non-breeding helpers. Some of them will disperse and they'll become unrelated helpers at a different group. And some of them just float in the population and don't help at all before they join a new breeding group as an adult and are reproductive in that group. But what's really unusual about anis, and Matthew alluded to this in his introduction, is that these young birds hardly ever breed in their natal groups. So they usually disperse, and they disperse really far distances. They disperse like up to several kilometers, which is very long for a tropical bird. And what that means is that the adults in these groups are not related to each other. They're genetically unrelated. And so when you see these communal groups of multiple reproductive pairs, these have mostly formed from pairs that join together as adults, and then 2 pairs come together and form a breeding group, but they're not family groups, which makes them a really interesting exception to a lot of animal societies where usually at least members of one sex, females or males, are usually related within groups. So ani life is mostly cooperative, but not always. It's always social, but it's not always cooperative. So sometimes the adults compete with each other as well. Like pretty much every animal society ever studied, there's competition between group members. And with the anis, that competition is most evident in the form of competition over reproduction among females. So I told you before that females can't recognize their own eggs, which is true, but they do seem to be aware of whether or not they've laid an egg. So if you're a female ani in a group like this photograph shows, if you're a female ani and you go to your nest one day, your communal nest that you've helped to build, and you see an egg in the nest, but you haven't laid an egg yet, you can be pretty sure, you know, physiologically know at least, that it's not your egg. And so if a female ani sees an egg in a nest before she's laid her own first egg, she will remove that egg from the nest. I usually show a video at this point, but because Zoom is not very good with videos, I sort of did a low-tech solution to that, which is to show you a few frames from the video. So here's a female ani who's looking at an egg in her communal nest, but it's not her own egg. So she'll use her bill to roll the egg up onto the rim of the nest like that. And once this egg is on the rim of the nest, then she'll push it overboard and there goes the egg. And so anis do this pretty much without fail every single time. So they're obligately communal. They always nest in groups, but that means that by definition in a group, there always has to be like one female that goes first. And because also by definition, there are always females in the group that haven't laid yet, that first laid egg is toast pretty much 100% of the time. So this form of competition that results in the removal of these early laid eggs is really stereotyped in anis. It's really repeatable. It follows a really predictable pattern. And I wasn't the first person to document this. Sandy Barenkamp, during her own PhD work in the 1970s, described this in groove-billed anis. Groove-billed anis are in the same genus as the greater ani. They're also communal nesters. And even though the two species are separated by many millions of years, they have a pretty much identical pattern of competition at the beginning of the laying cycle. So what happens in pretty much 100% of cases is that if you have a group with two females, female A lays her own first egg, but female B hasn't laid yet, so female B pushes it out of the nest. Then once female B has laid her own first egg, then both A and B have started to lay. And at this point, once a female has laid an egg, she stops pushing eggs out of the nest. As I said, that it could be conscious, it could be the awareness that they realize that they've laid an egg, but it could also just be a sort of a physiological switch that once they've started laying, they're no longer in the sort of behavioral mode of pushing the eggs out of the nest, and they allow eggs to accumulate. So in a two female group, once A and B have started to lay, then they can go on. Each female will continue to lay. They lay an egg once every 2 days. So they're pretty restricted in like the timing. They can't lay a whole bunch of eggs at once. So once both B and A have started laying, then the eggs can accumulate in the nest and they go on to form a stable clutch and everything's fine. That's kind of the best case scenario. There are a couple of variants. One variant is that sometimes the females are not completely reproductively synchronized. So sometimes female A might lay one egg and then 2 eggs, sometimes even 3 or 4 eggs before female B starts to lay. And if that happens, then all of those early laid eggs by female A get ejected before the clutch can accumulate. The other variant that can happen is if you have more than 2 females. So if you have 3 females where you have A and B and a C female, then again, the eggs can't accumulate in the nest until all of the females have started to lay. So female C has to start to lay before A and B's eggs can stay in the nest. And so in this case, you could get A and B laying a couple of eggs or even several eggs before female C starts to lay. So this really stereotyped pattern of egg ejection at the beginning of the laying cycle has some interesting consequences for how these groups work. And I'll walk you through those consequences quickly, because in order to really understand anything else about how anis cooperate, you kind of need to understand what goes on at the beginning of the nesting cycle. So one consequence is that this form of competition at the beginning really equalizes reproduction among females, because if you think about it, it means that no one female in the group can monopolize reproduction by starting to lay a bunch of eggs before the other females are ready. If you look at this cartoon schematic here, in all 3 of these instances, the final contribution to the clutch, the eggs that actually stay in the nest, is pretty equal among females in the nest. And that in the top 2, for example, females A and B each contribute 3 eggs to the final clutch. So that's really unusual among cooperatively breeding birds, that there's very little reproductive skew, and contributions among females at least are pretty equal. I'll say right now that we don't know as much about males as we do about females. It's a lot easier to figure out what's going on with females because they're the ones that are laying eggs. But we did look at the mating system of these groups, and those social pair bonds are a pretty good predictor of paternity. So there are extra pair copulations within the group, but it's relatively low. It's like 10%. So by and large, we think that the contributions of males to these communal clutches are mirroring the contributions of their female mates, that it's pretty equal among males as well as females. The second consequence of this is that reproductive synchrony is really important. So as I mentioned before, if you have a highly synchronized group, female A is in pretty good shape and her losses will be minimal. If you have a really poorly synchronized group, it's the opposite. So if you have a group, especially a large group, where the females are not ready to lay at the same time, then female A could lose several eggs. The costs could potentially be pretty high. And if female A loses 4 or 5 eggs to ejection, sometimes she'll stick with it, but sometimes she'll also stop laying, which can delay the whole group for quite a while. They sometimes have to stop and wait and try again later when the females are all ready. And sometimes they just stop and wait until the next year. So being reproductively synchronized can actually be pretty important. And the third consequence is just about group size. So as you can see, the more females you add to a group, the harder it is to synchronize their reproduction, the more sort of drama you get at the beginning of the nesting cycle. And this is one of the things, not the only thing, but it's one of the important things that probably limits group size. We think this is why it's rare to see groups with more than 3 laying females, because you can imagine if it's this hard to synchronize 3 females, it's even harder to synchronize 4. So when I first started studying these birds, the obvious questions were, okay, we can see that there are costs to communal nesting. So what are the benefits? Why are they doing this? So I will summarize 6 years of PhD work in blood, sweat, and tears and tell you that a big benefit of these cooperative groups, it comes from nest predation and the direct benefits of being able to protect your nestlings against nest predation. So in my PhD work, which was done between 2007 and 2009, these are some early data, I found that if you look at this figure on the left here, that 3-pair groups, so larger groups, are more successful than 2-pair groups. If you look at the black bars there, they're more likely to fledge young. So at the nest level, they're more likely to be successful. And at the individual level, if you look at those white bars, females in 3-pair groups fledge more offspring per individual than females in 2-pair groups. So that's interesting. We couldn't really look at what lone pairs would do because greater anis never nest as lone pairs. They don't even try to. They prefer to join a group and then try to nest. And the only time they'll ever nest as a lone pair is if they're part of a group, maybe with 2 pairs, and then something happens to a group member. Like if a group member disappears or dies or is killed by a predator, sometimes the remaining pair will attempt to continue, but they really don't do very well. And we've never, ever, in hundreds and hundreds of nesting attempts, we've never had a lone pair successfully fledge young. So we can't really compare group nesters to solitary nesters, but we do get the sense from the rarity of solitary nesting that it's not a very successful strategy. We also can't really see what's happening with 4-pair groups because those are also very rare. And the few times we've had groups with more than 3 laying females in the groups, those groups always dissolve before they get to the point of actually accumulating a stable clutch. So we've had groups that started out as 4-pair groups, but at some point during the nesting cycle, 1 pair abandons and they leave them. So this was cool. And I thought, well, great, we've solved this problem. If you look on the figure on the right, it's showing you individual reproductive output broken down by a female's position in the laying order. So a female A and B in a 2-pair group in the open diamonds, and females A, B, and C in a 3-pair group in the solid diamonds. And so what we looked at in terms of overall reproductive output on the right there is that females on the whole do better if they're in a 3-pair group than in a 2-pair group. And also reproduction is pretty equal among females, which is, this is the pattern for fledged nestlings. And I showed you earlier the pattern of egg laying that leads to that low reproductive skew. So great, that was a satisfying result. It was nice to show that there was a benefit to being in a larger group, but it actually raised, I think, more questions than it answered. The most puzzling of these to me is that if birds in 3-pair groups do so much better than 2-pair groups, why are there so many 2-pair groups? So in the population, actually smaller groups with just 2 pairs are much, much more common than these larger groups with 3 pairs. Only about 15% of all groups in the population are 3 pairs. So the vast majority are groups with 2 pairs. That was kind of puzzling. And it also led to lots of other interesting questions that have kept me occupied for many years after, things like confirming that there's no kin recognition within the groups, looking at mating patterns, looking at cognition, whether or not females can keep track of eggs in their nest. There are lots and lots of other cool questions that came along the way that we've looked at. But what I want to focus on today are a couple of the main themes that I find most interesting. And these are all, this is all really ongoing work, including some unpublished work that's really recent that we haven't quite figured out yet. The overarching question, obviously, is the general fitness costs and benefits of being in a nesting group, why they're nesting communally, and the selective pressures that have favored that. The importance of predation keeps coming back over and over again, and that's something that you'll hear a lot about today. But a related question is why the groups are so stable. So I mentioned at the beginning that these birds can stay with their same group members for quite a long time, sometimes several years. And so one of the things we've become interested in as a consequence of having a long-term data set is understanding whether there are any fitness benefits to being in a stable group or to knowing your group members, as opposed to switching between groups across years. A second big question, sort of that plays into the whole question of the evolutionary stability of cooperation and the selective pressures favoring communal nesting, is whether or not there is cheating in these social groups and what that might look like behaviorally. So a big problem in understanding the evolution of cooperation is, of course, understanding the countervailing forces of, the benefits of selfish behavior. So what maintains cooperative parental care in these groups, and why don't birds try to take advantage of their group members and maybe do a little bit less work and hope that their group members provide a little bit more? And the third question is why there's variation in group size, which is sort of the big paradox I mentioned at the beginning of why do we see groups of 2 and 3 pairs when we seem to see differences in fitness in these group members. So why is there variation in group size and what maintains that variation? One of the reasons I've chosen these 3 questions in particular is that I think even though they seem unrelated, there are actually deep linkages between them. And one of the things that is so rewarding about long-term research is that you start to see connections between apparently unrelated questions that you would have never thought of at the beginning. And so I hope to be able to share some of that with you. I started studying these birds as a graduate student. The reason I chose them was that no one else was studying them. There were no other field projects on greater anis at the time. I thought they had a really interesting social system. I knew that they were communal nesters because of Sandy Berenkamp's work with groove-billed anis. So work had been done on related species, but not on this species. But they look superficially similar. They live in groups, so I figured they're probably communal nesters too. Let's look at them. I went to Barrow, Colorado Island as a graduate student because my advisor was working there. I did not know greater anis were there. He did not know greater anis were there, and he did not at all think that I would want to study social behavior. But I went there to the field station on BCI in central Panama, and I was a bird watcher, and I saw these birds everywhere. And I thought, hey, there are greater anis here, and greater anis are related to groove-billed anis, and groove-billed anis are pretty cool. So this would be a really great topic for a PhD. No one else thought so at the time because, as I'll explain, there's some pretty big logistical challenges with studying them. So I was more enthusiastic than my committee was for sure. This photo shows Barrow, Colorado Island, which is a reserve operated by the Smithsonian in central Panama. And it shows the mainland peninsulas that surround BCI. And each of those red dots on the map is a communal nest of the greater ani. So each of those red dots is an ani group. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Hopefully you can see my cursor. Matthew says you can. This dot right here is where the field station is. This is where the lab clearing is and where the buildings are on BCI. And this is where the first group of anis is that I saw and that we have studied ever since. They always nest in the same place. I started the project in 2006 and it really kind of took shape in 2007. And I kept studying it through 2 postdocs and now into my assistant professorship at Princeton. The habitat is lowland tropical forest, and the anis always nest on the edges of waterways. Even though they're not aquatic birds, they always nest in vegetation, either overhanging the water or actually in the water. This means that most of the nests are accessible only by boat. This is a typical nesting site for a greater ani. This is a ficus branch that's on the mainland, but the tree branch is extending out over the water. And you can see there's an ani nest right there hanging over the water. They build these big open cup stick nests, like a big basket of eggs. They also really like emergent vegetation that's surrounded by water. This is a small tree, a nona glabra that grows in the water. And anis really like to nest in those sites as well that are isolated from the shoreline. And even better, they like to nest in these little islets of vegetation or on small islands. And the reason that they like to nest in the water or as close to the water as possible is that, as I mentioned before, predation is the most important factor limiting their reproductive success. So nest predation rates on all tropical birds are really high. It's usually between 90 and 99%, and the anis are no exception. And most of the nest failure that we see is caused by terrestrial predators. Snakes are far and away the most important nest predators. Capuchin monkeys also do their bit. There are some aerial predators, especially yellow-headed caracaras, but they're relatively minor compared to the terrestrial predators. So that's why the anis really love these isolated nest sites, because these predators have to swim to the nests to get to them, and they really don't like swimming, especially monkeys really hate swimming. So most of these isolated nest sites are a lot safer than the shoreline sites, which tend to get hit really hard by snakes. A consequence of this, though, and this is what people warned me about at the beginning, is that all of the fieldwork has to be done from small boats. This is a photograph of my longtime project manager, Megan Strong, and one of our great undergrads, Luke Caravia, motoring away from a nest they've just checked. When you band birds, all the banding has to be done in the boat. Here's Megan and Maria, a graduate student, and Zach, another great undergraduate. You'll see all these names again because they've all contributed a lot to the data in this talk. They're banding a nestling here. If you take measurements of eggs, that has to be done in the boat as well. And the worst part is that when you track birds, that has to be done in the water as well. So Josh LaPergola has been doing fantastic work rigging up these net systems in the water. If you've ever misnetted birds, you know that misnets are pretty challenging to work with to begin with. Much more challenging when you have to take the birds out of the misnets when you're in a kayak. And this is Amanda at a furled net, waiting to open them and hope that anis fly in. And over the years, what we've accumulated is a data set on individuals in this population, mostly females, and I'll explain why. We track all the nests. We try to find every single nest in the population, at least in our study area. We find every egg as it's laid, and we give every egg a number with a Sharpie so that we know what happens to it. We can track its fate. And we can also do some genetic work by taking a blood sample from the outside of these eggs. So this photograph here shows a blood smear on an egg where this blood was left behind by the female that laid the egg. So we can actually genotype the blood and other shed cells and materials from the female that laid the egg if we get there fast enough. And what that gives us is a really rich genetic history. By individually genotyping all of the egg-laying females in the population, we can track them over time, even when we don't have them banded. So that's allowed us to look at individual histories, especially of females. As I say, with males, we're limited to just the ones we have actually banded and individually marked, which I wish we could say we had 10,000 of them banded, like with Ellen's Juncos, but unfortunately we don't. We only have a few hundred banded. And we try to contribute to that as well by banding and taking blood samples from nestlings as we band them so that we can track their fates as they grow older. I used to think these sample sizes were impressive until I saw Ellen's talk last week, so I think I won't say any more about that. So the first question here about this question of group stability, this was interesting to me because it really has not been studied in birds. There's a lot more known about social stability and the fitness effects of social bonds in primates, and you heard more about that from Joan Silk's talk a couple weeks ago. Birds, we don't know a lot about this because most birds don't live in groups like this. Most birds that are cooperative breeders live in family groups where the young birds disperse after a couple of years. And so there really isn't a lot of variation in group stability where we can investigate the consequences of what it means to live in the same groups with the same individuals over time. I started thinking about this in part because of this photo. This was a picture taken in 2017 by our undergraduate Luke. And this bird on the left here was banded in 2007. And so he took the picture 10 years later. The bird's sitting in exactly the same tree that it was sitting in when it was banded. So they don't like to move. When they find a good nesting territory, they stay on it. And that means they wind up staying with their group members for a long time. On average, it's about 3.5 years, but that actually masks the fact that the duration of social groups is really bimodal. Some groups stay together for just a year or two, and then some groups stay together for a really long time. So the longest social group we have in the population, the same females have been breeding together since we started in 2007. And they're, as far as I know, they're there right now getting ready to breed again. And if it weren't for coronavirus, we'd be there watching them. And so what that means is that on average, a female changes groups once every 4.5 years or so. So the whole group will stay together with no individuals changing for about 3.5 years, which means that from an individual perspective, it's rarer than that. So females change groups once every 4.5 years or so, which means they probably only change groups a couple times during their lifetimes. And as with this kind of data, as you saw from Joan's talk a couple weeks ago, there's a correlation between group stability and age, because groups that are stable and have been together for a long time, by definition, have to have animals in those groups that are old enough to have been in the groups for that long. So we wanted to know whether there was really any benefit to these very long lasting bonds. One reason I thought there could be is that in other birds, as I said, there's very little data on cooperative groups, but in pair nesting birds, there's a lot of data showing that a male and a female that stay together for a long time are better at coordinating their parental care activities than pairs that are recently formed. So with anis, you could imagine that it could be the same thing and only scaled up, because these are essentially all co-parents in the same group. They're raising young together. So they have to coordinate all of the same parental care activities that a male and a female do in a biparental system. They just have 2 males or 3 males and 2 males or 3 females to have to coordinate. So we weren't really able to look at the consequences of male stability in groups, but we were able to look more at females because we have a lot more data on females. And what we wanted to know was, the first things that occurred to me were sort of the obvious ones. So maybe being familiar with your female co-breeder helps in synchronizing reproduction at the beginning of the laying cycle, which, as I explained, is pretty important to determining the overall costs of being in one of these groups. So I thought it might affect reproductive synchrony, and I thought there also could be an effect similar to what's been shown for pair nesting birds. There could also be an effect of just parental coordination. Maybe you are more efficient at delivering food. Maybe you're more efficient at protecting your young against predators. So maybe there would be an effect of survival as well. And again, a third prediction drawn from the biparental care literature was having to do with the timing of nesting. I thought perhaps long established groups or groups that already knew their fellow group members might lay earlier in the season than ones that had recently formed. So I won't go through the nitty-gritty details. I'll just tell you some of the overall patterns. The most striking of these was in reproductive synchrony. It was actually a lot stronger than I expected. I was hoping maybe we'd find some small effect, but unusually, we actually found a really clear effect. What this figure shows is the number of days that it takes for 2 females to synchronize their laying. So what that means is it's the number of days that elapse between when the first female lays her first egg and when the last female lays her first egg. So this is the number of days that elapse between females A and B in a 2-pair group, or between females A and C in a 3-pair group. And what this shows is that the patterns are different for 2 and 3 female groups, as you'd expect. And in both panels, no transition means the females had already nested together before. And transition means that there was a difference across years in the females, that either 1 or 2 of the females had changed groups. So what you can see from this is that if you're in a 2-female group where the females have nested together previously, where there was no transition from year 1 to year 2, it only takes those 2 females about 2 days to synchronize laying. What that means is that female A lays on day 1 and female B lays on day 2. So that's pretty tight. But if those 2 females have not nested together before, if there was a transition here, that increases the duration of that time from 2 days to about 6 days. So it means that female A actually lays a couple of eggs before female B starts laying. So it really affects synchrony. The same trend is obvious with the 3 female groups. It's just that it takes them longer in both cases because A, B, and C have to start laying. So in a 3 female group, if all 3 females have laid together previously, it takes them about 5 days to synchronize reproduction. Whereas if even one of those females is different, it takes them closer to 9 days. So that's a really long time. I mean, actually, when you think about a reproductive cycle for a pair nesting bird, 9 days, usually it takes them like 2 days to lay a clutch, 2 or 3 days to lay a clutch of eggs, and then they start incubating and that's it. With these birds, it can take them, over a week just to stop ejecting eggs and to let eggs accumulate in the nest. That's a pretty long time. That's an additional 9 days that the nest is available for predators to find the eggs. It's a pretty big cost. The obvious consequence of this is that there's less egg loss, or fewer eggs are ejected in these more synchronized groups. And this is showing on the y-axis, instead of the time that it takes to synchronize reproduction, this is showing the number of eggs that are ejected in 2 female groups and in 3 female groups. And again, showing those groups where the females were familiar with each other, where there wasn't a transition, those are in black bars, and where there was a transition in the gray bars. I'm sorry, other way around. Where there was a transition, where the groups were unstable in black and the stable groups in gray. So one thing we worried about, and actually I saw that Joan had mentioned this exact problem when she was talking about the consequences of associations among individuals in her baboon population, is the problem of cause and effect, because you could imagine that maybe it's not that familiar females are more highly synchronized. It might be that females that are more synchronized are more likely to stay together. And so you get this association because the causality is actually going the opposite direction. So we couldn't really test this directly, but what we could do was we could ask whether synchrony itself predicted whether those females would stay in the group the following year. And we actually found that there was no effect of synchrony on group stability. So partnership in 1 year predicts how highly synchronized the females will be the next year, but the opposite is not true. So I think in this case, we can say with some confidence that it's the social familiarity in whatever sense that means. We don't really know what these interactions look like between these females. We can say that they nested together before they didn't, but we don't really know how differentiated these social bonds are. We don't even really know whether we can call them social bonds. It's not quite analogous to the situation with baboons, where you have all of this lovely data on focal follows of individuals where you can really see how they're interacting with each other and what they're doing. But we can say that there does seem to be an effect of at least even being in the same social group together. We also looked at whether there would be some overall effective coordination on parental care, like I mentioned at the beginning, but we didn't see any effect of that. So it doesn't seem like these stable groups are any better at delivering food or protecting their young against predators. But the big effect that it has on reproductive success is on the amount of time that the nest is exposed to predation. So if you've ever done cumulative survival curves for nest success, you know that the longer the nest is exposed to predation, the longer the eggs are in the nest and the nestlings are in the nest, every single day, there's a chance that that nest will be found by a predator. So the more days, the higher the chance is that the nest will be found by a predator. And so if you look at the cumulative survival curves, in these figures, what I'm showing is the probability that the nest will make it to the next stage. So the probability that a nest will make it from the ejection stage to the laying stage, from the laying stage to the incubation stage, and from the incubation stage to the nestling stage. And those probabilities are shown on the y-axis, and the black and red lines are showing groups where there was no transition, a stable group in black, and groups where there was a transition in red. And so you can see that there is basically overall, these unstable groups have lower cumulative survival probabilities based just on the amount of time that it takes them to get to the laying stage, essentially. So there does seem to be an effect of overall fitness, but there doesn't seem to be an effect of parental coordination on this. So we thought, okay, that's cool. That was what we'd set out to do. We published it in Proceedings B. I was like, great, now we know why Anis stay in groups together. But no, actually we discovered additional advantages of staying with the same group that we hadn't known to look for. We found these advantages while we were looking at other behaviors. So I mentioned that about 90% of Ani nests fail, 90% of the failures of Ani nests are caused by predation. What I didn't tell you is that the remaining 10% are mostly caused by Anis destroying each other's nests. So it's the remaining 10% are intergroup conflict between nesting groups that are nesting in the same area. This is pretty, behaviorally, it's a pretty striking thing to see. So on the top here, this is a photograph of a nice Ani nest that's incubating and everyone's happy. They've stopped ejecting eggs, it's all fine. And then you go to check the nest the next day and you find all the eggs on the ground underneath the nest. So unlike the egg ejection that happens at the beginning of the laying period, this is like a very unpredictable thing. All the eggs just suddenly are turfed out of the nest and you don't know why, and you didn't see who did it, and you don't know whether it was intergroup conflict or intragroup conflict. At least we didn't at first. Eventually, we hypothesized that it was probably conflict between groups from purely circumstantial evidence, which I'll show you in a minute. But then, unexpectedly, we got confirmation of this when one of our great undergraduates, Danielle Olmstead, she was doing her senior thesis in Panama last year, and she put out a bunch of fake Ani nests with fake Ani eggs in them. And we were thinking, this is great, we'll capture nest predation. We were not thinking about intergroup conflict at all. We were thinking about, trying to identify snakes and identify monkeys and see who's actually getting these nests. Well, it turns out that predators do not like fake Ani eggs. They do not care about them and they don't find them, probably because they're using other cues to find real nests, but the Anis found them. So these are two photographs on the bottom here from Danielle's artificial nest setup, where she put out these fake nests and she put out fake eggs in them. And within a few hours, Anis from neighboring groups turned up and completely destroyed them. You should see the photographs that she got of the eggs after the Anis had been at them. In some cases, the whole group came and spent up to a few hours destroying the nest and returning again to make sure that all the eggs were gone. So they're pretty aware of neighboring groups, and they sometimes destroy neighboring groups' nesting attempts. So substantial evidence that we had collected already, we knew that there were a couple of things that influenced this. So this intergroup conflict is most likely when two groups try to nest together on a high quality territory. And what I mean by a high quality territory is one of these little islands of vegetation that's really safe from predation. So these islands of vegetation, the Ani groups compete for them. Once a group is on these, on one of these small islands, they like to stay there. And that's probably why they defend their territories year round. So we had already shown just through circumstantial evidence with no behavioral evidence whatsoever. We had never even seen this happening when we published this paper in 2018. But we knew circumstantially that if you compare clutches that are not destroyed, that is group nests that are not sabotaged by neighbors versus those that are, the predictors are the territory quality. So it's much more likely to get your nest destroyed if you're on one of these high quality sites. And crucially, if another group is nesting close by. So it really seems to be when two groups are directly competing over nesting on the same territory. You don't see a lot of this behavioral conflict before they lay eggs, which is kind of interesting. And so I thought, okay, great. Well, if we have this situation where we know that two groups are trying to nest together on the same high quality territory, I bet the predictor is going to be group size. Large groups are going to be able to outcompete small groups, and that's why we get this effect. Wrong. When we actually looked at the size of the groups between the losers, the ones whose nest got destroyed, and the winners, the ones that got to stay, there was actually no significant effect of group size. It's a little higher on average for the winning groups, but it's not significant. By contrast, the thing that really is significant is whether or not that group has been established on the territory before, whether or not they've nested there before. So if you look at the number of years that that group has been on the territory, the losing groups are usually the newcomers. So the losing group usually has fewer than 3 years of nesting in that area, whereas the winning group usually has nested in that area for several years already. So it seemed like there was this effect of sort of tenure on the territory that was stronger than the effect just of group size. So that was a positive effect of basically being in the same group on the same territory that we hadn't thought to look for when we were thinking about, you know, how to investigate the effects of social stability. And the reason we hadn't thought about it is that this is a relatively infrequent behavior. You know, 8% or so of nests are destroyed in this way. And we had already sort of thought of it as kind of this random weird thing that happens only occasionally. But it's actually pretty important because when these groups are destroyed, these nests are destroyed, they usually don't nest again that year. It essentially destroys their reproductive output for the whole year, and it means that the next year they have to find a place to nest somewhere else. They have to establish a whole new territory. There was yet a third positive effect of social stability, again, something we hadn't thought about looking for at the beginning, which is that unstable groups, groups where there's a transition, are much more likely to skip reproduction than groups that have nested together previously. When there's a change in group membership, they often don't lay eggs at all the following year. So again, this was just kind of a random thing. We had thought other things would explain the frequency of reproduction, and social stability kind of snuck in the back door. The second question I want to talk about is this idea of cheating within groups, and whether or not group members are really all pulling their equal weight. One way you could cheat in a social group is to let other group members do more work. And I'll get to that in a minute. But the other way, the more obvious way that you can cheat as an Ani is to not provide parental care at all. So this was an alternative strategy of being a parasite and dumping your egg in a neighboring group's nest that, again, we didn't know to look for. This is something that only emerged out of the genotyping data from looking at eggs, when we realized that a very small percentage of eggs are actually laid by females that are not in the nesting group. They're laid by extra group parasites that dump an egg in the nest and don't participate in parental care and don't participate in the life of the group. A curious thing about this, and again, you know, once you see one pattern, more questions emerge. A curious thing about this is the parasitic eggs are typically not very successful. They're usually not laid at the right time. Parasites often lay them either before the group has started laying, so they're ejected, or they lay them after the group has started incubating, and so they have low hatching success. So the question then is, okay, we see this interesting rare behavior, but why do they act as parasites? And we were in the unusual position of being able to actually look at this because we have this long-term genotyping database where we can track individual female histories over years and see what their lives were like leading up to the point when they acted as parasites. And the really cool result was that these females are not acting as specialized parasites. These are mostly females that were part of a breeding group. They begin the breeding season in a cooperative group. And if the nest is destroyed by predators, again, the importance of predation here, if the nest is destroyed by predators while they're still laying, those females will then just try to dump an egg in the nearest nest they can find. And that's why they're not really highly synchronized with the group that they parasitize. So it seems to be kind of a best of a bad job strategy. If your options are either wait until next year or try to dump an egg, they will try to dump an egg, even if it's a pretty low probability of success. The only significant predictors of whether or not a female acts as a parasite are basically if she loses her nest to predation, so if she's already part of a group and that group is depredated, and if the predation happens while she's laying. So those are basically why females act as parasites. And as I said, they're not really that great at selecting where to parasitize. In fact, they mostly just dump their egg in the nearest nest. It's probably a nest that they're aware of, they already know about it, and that's the first place they go to when they have to dump an egg. Another really cool outcome of this, which I didn't know to look for at the beginning, was that this option, whether you take the option of just waiting or whether you lay parasitically, It's actually really repeatable across years. And we wouldn't have known this if we hadn't had the long-term data to be able to look at females who parasitize multiple times. Only about 15% of females in the population ever act as parasites. The majority just stop laying. But there are a few of them that quickly shift to this parasitic strategy. And I sort of thought of these as like birds that always cooperate, the pure cooperators, versus the ones that practice like a mixed strategy, those that start to cooperate, but if that fails, then switch to parasitism. And what I was able to see from the long-term data is that if you look across years, it actually doesn't matter very much whether you parasitize or if you don't. The reason for that is that the pure cooperators, the ones that don't act as parasites, tend to lay more eggs. They tend to have slightly larger clutches in their own nests. The ones that have this mixed strategy lay smaller clutches, even when they're not depredated, even when they're not acting as parasites, they lay slightly smaller clutches. So it seems like there could be a trade-off between kind of literally like putting all your eggs in one basket versus spreading your eggs around and laying parasitically. So there's these different size, but if you actually look at the offspring fledged, it doesn't differ. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. It doesn't differ from parasites to non-parasites. That's a different question though from what I asked before about whether group members work equally hard or whether they can sort of cheat, so to speak, by holding back a little bit and trying to let other birds in the group do more work. And I'll say right away that we don't really know the answer to this question yet because we don't have enough detailed data on individual contributions within the nest, but we're starting to look at it. Maria Smith, is doing her PhD work on this right now, and she's getting really super high resolution data on exactly what each adult is doing in the nest. So before she started this work, we knew that there were some inequalities. We knew that in all of these groups, just one male does all the nocturnal incubation. She's abbreviated this as NI here, the nocturnally incubating male. So when you look at these, this is just preliminary data from a couple of groups with 2 pairs. When you look at diurnal incubation, if it were equally distributed among all birds, that would be represented by this dashed line. So that shows kind of like theoretically the equal contribution of all birds. For diurnal incubation, the nocturnally incubating male does less, which kind of makes sense because he's sitting on the eggs all night long, but it's relatively equal among the other 3 birds in the nest. They all contribute about equally to diurnal incubation. With nest building, the pattern is the opposite. The nocturnal incubator does more than the rest, and at least in this group, one female did a little bit less. So there are some inequalities, at least it's not completely equal, especially with nocturnal incubation. The really cool thing is that the patterns look very different in groups with 3 pairs. So this is, again, just preliminary data from a couple of groups. But if you look at the same 2 behaviors, diurnal incubation and nest building, in these groups with 3 pairs, the 3rd pair is doing very little. And this actually aligns with what we see anecdotally in the field, that the 3rd pair, you rarely see all 3 pairs at the nest until later in the nesting cycle. So it might be that this 3rd pair really starts to pull their weight when it comes to feeding the nestlings or to defending the nest against predators. We don't really know, but hopefully we'll be able to tell you in a few years whether or not this pattern, whether this 3rd pair is really more slacking, whether they're really just not pulling their weight, or whether maybe there are certain behaviors where they do contribute a lot and it does matter later on, like with nestling feeding. So the last question I'll circle back to, because I think it really ties into these other 2 questions. And to me, it really illustrates how linked all of these questions are, is to circle back to this question about group size and what maintains variation in groups with 2 and 3 pairs. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, one thing that really perplexed me, even as far back as 2009, was why are large groups rarer if they do better than small groups? And not just a little bit better, a lot better, if you believe these data from 2007, 2008, and 2009, right? They're doing way better than smaller groups. They have really high success rates. So why are they so rare? So part of this gets back to some of the other patterns I talked about earlier, which is that groups do skip reproduction sometimes. And I mentioned this when I talked about the result that stable groups are less likely to skip reproduction than unstable groups. So if you look at the proportion of groups and of females that actually breed every year, there is a ton of variation. In some groups, in some years, it's really high, like in 2017 and in 2007, about 90% of the groups in the population laid eggs. But in some years, it's really low, like in 2009 and 2015 was super low. It dipped all the way down to 30% in 2015. There was almost no reproduction in 2015. And being on BCI and talking to other researchers there and just going out in the field every day, it was really obvious to us what was going on by 2015. This was not obvious to me in 2009, but by 2015, it was clear that in El Nino years, very few groups breed, whereas in La Nina years, which in Panama, La Nina years are cooler and rainier, and El Nino years are hotter and drier. In La Nina years, more birds breed than in El Nino years. So I have this great undergraduate who he graduated this past last year actually, and he did his senior thesis analyzing the long-term data from the ANI project and looking at the effect of climate on reproductive output. I thought it was going to be impossible to do. I told him the statistics would be way too hard for him, but he tackled the whole thing, became a statistics pro, and came up with some really cool insights that, again, I would have never known to look for. These are only things that emerged after basically 2 strong El Nino cycles, which took, over a decade to see. And he used mixed models to look at the different climate factors that predict breeding in the Anis. And 2 of the ones that emerge as important are how frequent high temperatures are. So in really hot summers, fewer birds breed where you have really high temperatures happening frequently. The other is the length of the dry season. So in years with long dry seasons, these are again El Nino years, groups are much less likely to lay eggs than in wet, cool La Nina years. And the thing that really gobsmacked me that we haven't published yet, I'm still sort of working through this. It's a complicated result, and there's a lot of other stuff going on here, is that Zach found an interaction between group size and climate, such that if you look at the reproductive success, the per capita offspring of birds in 2-pair groups, that's shown in the salmon color, it's about the same. 2-pair groups, climate doesn't seem to affect them very much. 3-pair groups, it does affect them a lot. 3-pair groups actually do a lot better than 2-pair groups in wet years. And in the first 3 years of my PhD, 2007 and 2008 were La Nina years. And so we got this huge effect of group size in those wet years. But in dry years, 3-pair groups do really badly. In fact, there were no successful 3-pair groups at all in 2016, which is the year that had the longest dry season. So it seems like there's this really weird interaction being driven by the effect of climate on larger groups. And we don't know what is behind that interaction. So it could be that it has to do with being able to find enough food to really bring off a big clutch in a wet year. It could be an effect of predation. We're really not sure yet. But what it means is that if you look over longer timescales, not just 2007 to 2009, a lot of that what looked like a really big effect of group size on fitness pretty much goes away. There's still a trend for reproductive output to be higher in 3-pair groups, but it's no longer even statistically significant because the variation across years is so great. I'm almost done, don't worry. So looking at this interaction, the next question coming down the pike for me is, okay, well, it seems like you should just be part of a 3-pair group in a wet year and be part of a 2-pair group in a dry year. It seems like group size should be more flexible. Maybe birds should just move between groups. But that's not at all what we see. We see these really stable groups over time. We see stability in group size. So once a 3-pair group, you're usually a 3-pair group. And I think that, it could partly be that these effects of group stability that I mentioned before are serious enough that they really prevent birds from moving quickly between groups, from changing their groups across years. It could also be that, there's more complicated stuff going on with these larger groups. Maybe cheating really is more common in larger groups, and that's something that limits their frequency. We don't really know, but I do know that I can see a lot more possibilities and have a lot more new questions to ask because of having these long-term data on the other questions that I mentioned that, superficially at least don't seem related at all. And I think that gets to these otherwise hidden phenomena that that the other people in the seminar series have talked about, that you start a long-term project by asking a question and it leads you to other questions. But really the cool thing about this is that when you get what you think is the answer to one question, it turns out to inform your other questions in ways that you would not have thought possible at the beginning. So with that, I will thank Matthew very much for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you all for your patience, and I will be happy to take questions if anyone is still has the time to stay online for a few more minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Christy. I thought that was terrific. We do have some questions. Looks like we have about 4 or 5 of them, and so maybe we can spend a few minutes on them.
Sure.
The first question from Rita Kovas says, thanks a lot for a great talk. You show that the first eggs are systematically lost, so we would expect females to invest a lot less in those eggs. Is that the case?
It is.
Can you tell us what you know about egg size and content and how that changes with laying order?
Yes. That's a great question. It's one that I get a lot, and I thought of it as well in the first couple of years. So it's something I tackled in graduate school. On average, first laid eggs are a little bit smaller, but not a lot. They're still fertile. They're still, Ani eggs in general are pretty large relative to female body size, so it's still a pretty significant investment. They're a little bit smaller. We don't know much about the content, so we don't know anything about maternal allocation to those eggs. We really didn't study that. I think that, if a female could be absolutely sure that her egg would definitely be pushed out of the nest while she was making that egg, then you'd expect selection to be a lot stronger to affect this egg size. And I think there are two things that limit that. One is uncertainty, because it takes 2 days to build an Ani egg. And in those 2 days, you don't really know whether or not other females in your group are going to start to lay. So you don't know for sure whether you're going to be the first female. You don't know whether the other females are starting to lay. But there's a lot of behaviors that we think contribute to reproductive synchrony, where the birds in these groups get together, they're building the nest together, there are communal displays they do before they lay eggs. So they may not know for sure whether they're going to be the first or not. The second thing that I think limits it is just physiological. In birds, there's a lot more flexibility, or a lot more variation, I should say, between females in egg size than within females. It seems actually kind of physiologically a bit constrained for females to adaptively modify the size of their egg on the fly like that. So it could be constraint, it could be uncertainty. There's a small effect, but it's not huge.
And then I'm going to try to kind of synthesize a couple of questions into one. One from Shaylee Shaw, and one from Emily Levy, and one from Mark Halber, who all are asking kind of about how the process between changing from 2 groups to more groups might work. And so the questions are, in good years, are 2-pair groups more likely to become 3-pair groups? And what is stopping 3-pair groups from becoming 4-pair groups in good years? And then also, are females preventing other pairs, or are the resident pairs preventing new pairs from coming? What does that competitive process look like?
Right. Those are all really good questions. So I'll say first that those are the things I want to study next. So I can't give you definitive answers to all of those. But I think there are a couple things to keep in mind. And that is that there are 2 different fitness perspectives. One is, say you're in a 2-pair group, and you're deciding whether or not to allow a 3rd pair to join. So behaviorally, we think that there is conflict over this. Sometimes we certainly see instances where pairs try to join a group and are not allowed to join the group. And we see behavioral conflict in these groups with chasing and fighting. And we also think that there's sometimes where females pairs, I should say, trying to join groups might be part of what's contributing to these intergroup conflicts as well. So one fitness perspective is, you're already in a group, you have a territory, you have your group. The other fitness perspective is, say you're a lone pair and your option is either to not nest at all or to try to join a 2-pair group and become a 3-pair group. So from the perspective of that pair, it's probably better to be part of a 3-pair group than not a group at all. But from the perspective of the other 2 pairs in the group, it might be better to be part of a 2-pair group than a 3-pair group. So you could have 2 different things going on. There doesn't seem to be as much flexibility as I would have imagined. So I think one question was, do you see 2-pair groups becoming 3-pair groups in good years, or 3-pair groups becoming 4-pair groups? And puzzlingly, the answer to that is really no. We don't see like a higher proportion of 3-pair groups in some years than in other years. That seems to be relatively stable, at least to the best of our knowledge. But there was something else I was going to say about this. And 4-pair groups. I think the reason that we don't see 4-pair groups is that really hits up against the upper limit of how many eggs can fit in a nest. So in a 4-pair group, in addition to having the problems of synchronizing all 4 females reproductively and having those early laying females really paying a pretty big cost in terms of egg ejection, the other thing is that hatching rates start to go down after about 9 eggs. So if each female lays 3 or 4 eggs in the final clutch, which is what we see in the smaller groups, if that were to carry over to the bigger groups, a 4-pair group would have like 12 to 16 eggs in the nest. And there's definitely decreases in hatching rates at those clutch sizes. So I think regardless of how beneficial it might be to have extra birds to feed nestlings and to defend against predators, there's kind of a hard upper limit there in terms of clutch size. So we don't see as much flexibility as we would have thought, and we don't know why. And stay tuned, maybe we'll figure it out.
Great. And maybe we'll just finish with one more question about from Dai Shizuka about variation between populations. So he asks, is there anything known about variation among population and social systems, for example, group size? And if not, what would you expect to see in terms of variation across populations, and why?
Oh, that's such a good question. So this is part of the frustrating thing about having a long-term study on the only population of a species that's been studied. In groove-billed anis, there is geographic variation. I believe that so in groove-billed anis, social nesting is facultative, and there are some populations that have a higher proportion of pair nesters than in other populations. I can't remember how it goes. I think it might be that northern populations have more solitary pairs and southern populations have more group nests, but I might have that reversed. So I don't see any reason that the same wouldn't be true for greater anis, and I could easily imagine a population of greater anis somewhere where there are lone pairs and there are solitary nesters. If that's so, then it would be really interesting. And I wish that someone would go study greater anis in Peru or Brazil or Venezuela or in one of the Amazonian parts of their range, because that's really the center of their range. I'm studying the northern edge of their range, and sometimes it keeps me up at night thinking about whether I'm just studying some weird, peripheral outlier, and maybe the species does something totally different in South America. If anyone wants to do a PhD project, I have a couple up my sleeve.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for agreeing to give this talk. I think it was really wonderful. And I'll just announce that for next week, for everyone out there, we have Dr. Craig Packard going to be talking about long-term studies of lions and what we can learn from them. So thanks again, Christy.
Thank you, Matthew, and thanks to all of you for sticking with it for this long.